Caesar's Gallic Wars. Picture this. It's 58 BC, and one man, as desperate need for money and military glory, is about to reshape the entire map of Western Europe forever. That man, Gaius Julius Caesar, and what he is about to do in Gaul will echo through history for the next 2,000 years. Now, before we dive into this epic tale of conquest, ambition, and brilliant military strategy, you need to understand something crucial about ancient Rome. The Republic was cracking at the seams. Civil wars had been tearing the place apart for nearly 50 years, and everyone knew the old system was on its last legs. The Gauls had been Rome's bitter enemies for centuries. These Celtic warriors had actually sacked Rome itself once upon a time, and they'd fought alongside every major threat the Republic had ever faced. Think Pyrrhus, think Hannibal. The Gauls were always there, always ready for a scrap with Rome. By the late 2nd century BC, the Romans had managed to subdue most of southern Gaul, but the north was still a powder keg waiting to explode. And that explosion was coming whether Rome liked it or not. Here's where our story really begins. Rome had just survived decades of civil war chaos. Both Marius and Sulla had actually marched their armies on Rome itself. Imagine that. It showed everyone that the legions were more loyal to their commanders than to the state. Not exactly what you'd call a stable situation, is it? Out of this mess came an unofficial alliance between three of Rome's most powerful men, the First Triumvirate. They called it, though nobody was supposed to know about it officially. You had Pompey the Great, the famous general who'd made his name across the Mediterranean. Now, Caesar had just finished his year as consul in 59 BC. But here's the thing. All that political campaigning had left him absolutely skint. Worse still, he'd made enemies left, right, and center in Rome. The man was desperate. He needed to make serious money fast. And he needed military victories to keep his political rivals at bay. When it came time to divvy up the provinces for Caesar to govern, he used his political connections brilliantly. He secured not one, not two, but 3 provinces: Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul, for an unprecedented 5 years. This gave him command of 4 veteran legions: the 7, 8, X, and X. These were UNC's any soldiers. They fought with Caesar before in Hispania and were absolutely devoted to him. All told, Caesar commanded roughly 22,000 legionaries plus auxiliaries. He had the men he needed. Now all he required was an excuse for war. And wouldn't you know it? The excuse came gift-wrapped with a bow on top. The Helvetii, a Celtic tribe from what's now Switzerland, were planning a massive migration into Gaul in 58 BC. Their leader, Vercingetorix, had convinced not just his own people, but several neighboring tribes, the Latibrige, Raraci, and Boy, to join this great exodus. We're talking about 368,000 men, women, and children here. Vercingetorix had even convinced them all to burn their homes behind them. Talk about commitment. No, going back now was there, but here is where things get interesting. Vercingetorix was soon accused of trying to become a tyrant and was forced to commit suicide. Command passed to a fellow called Devico, who was absolutely determined to stick to the plan. The Romans had developed a healthy fear of migrating tribes ever since the Cimbrian War, back in 113 to 101 BC. Those Germanic hordes had nearly brought Rome to its knees. So when Caesar heard about this new migration, he was only too willing to come to the rescue of Rome's Gallic allies. he took the only legion available in the area and force-marched them up to Geneva, destroying the bridge over the Rhone that would have given the Helvetii easy access into Roman territory. Brilliant move. That the Helvetii sent envoys to Caesar, asking politely for permission to pass through Roman lands. They promised they wouldn't cause any trouble, scouts' honor, and all that. But Caesar, the crafty devil, played for time. He pretended to consider their offer for nearly 15 days, whilst his boys were busy constructing a massive fortified embankment. Picture this, a wall nearly 5 meters high stretching for 20 miles along the riverbank. When it was finished, Caesar had his answer ready. Absolutely not. Some of the Helvetii tried to force their way across anyway, in small boats. But the Roman legionaries made short work of them with javelins and arrows. With the southern route blocked solid, the Helvetii decided to take the longer northern route through the mountains. Caesar left his top lieutenant, Labienus, in command and headed back to Italy. He needed more men. He levied 2 new legions and pulled his other 3 veteran legions out of winter quarters, bringing his total force to approximately 33,000 legionaries, plus auxiliaries, nearly 50% more troops than he'd started with. Now, here's something interesting. Labienus was in a perfect position to block the mountain pass and keep the Helvetii bottled up, but he didn't. The Helvetii pushed through into Gallic territory and started pillaging the countryside. The Gauls, naturally, begged Caesar to intervene and chase these troublemakers out. Was this incompetence on Labienus's part? Hardly. This was almost certainly Caesar's plan all along. With the Celts now in open terrain, perfect ground for Roman legions, and their pillaging giving Caesar a perfect excuse to intervene, everything was going exactly according to plan. Caesar got word that the Helvetii were attempting to cross the Arar River. They'd been at it for days, moving in 4 large groups, using rafts and boats. But here's the thing about moving nearly 400,000 people. It takes time. An organization wasn't exactly their strong suit. One group was still waiting to cross when Caesar arrived with 3 legions. The Romans formed up quickly and fell upon the Celts like a hammer blow. Caught completely unaware, weighed down by their baggage, the Helvetii didn't even have time to form a proper battle line. It was a massacre. The entire stranded group was either killed or fled into the nearby woods, whilst the other 3 groups could only watch helplessly from across the river. But Caesar wasn't finished. The main Helvetii force started moving again, and Caesar wasn't about to lose the initiative. His engineers built a bridge across the river in just 1 day. 1 day. The crossing that had taken the Celts 20 days took the Romans just 1. Caesar began following the Helvetii like a predator stalking its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. There were a few cavalry skirmishes here and there, but nothing decisive. Caesar actually found a battlefield that looked promising once, and even had Labienus positioned behind the enemy. But poor intelligence from his scouts forced him to pull back. This delay caused problems. Caesar's army was running low on supplies, so he decided to head to the nearby town of bankrupt to resupply before continuing the pursuit. But as soon as the Romans started marching away, Divico saw his chance and gave chase, harassing the rear of Caesar's army. Caesar wasn't about to be caught on the march by a superior force. He sent his cavalry and light infantry to fight a delaying action whilst he deployed his main force on a nearby hill. It was a textbook Roman deployment. The 4 veteran legions formed 3 lines at the front, with the 2 newly recruited legions and auxiliaries positioned further up the hill. These new lads weren't expected to do any fighting. They were there to guard the baggage and spread thin across the hill to make Caesar's army look bigger than it actually was. Psychological warfare at its finest. The Helvetii numbering somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 warriors, had successfully fought off the Roman cavalry and light infantry. Now they formed their infantry into a tight shield wall, the classic Celtic formation, and advanced on the Romans. The front two lines of legionaries opened the battle with a volley of javelins. Now, Roman javelins were designed to bend on impact, making them useless to throw back and impossible to remove from shields. The Helvetii were forced to drop their shields and break into a looser formation. With the shield wall disrupted, the Roman front lines charged. The fighting was absolutely brutal. These weren't farmers with pitchforks. These were experienced Celtic warriors fighting for their lives. But Roman discipline and experience began to tell. Slowly, methodically, they pushed the Helvetii back towards a nearby mountain. Just when it looked like the Romans had things well in hand, roughly 15,000 warriors from the Boii and Tulingi tribes entered the battle. These lads had been acting as a rearguard, protecting the camp, and now they smashed into the Roman flank, threatening to surround Caesar's entire force. The Helvetii, seeing their allies arrive, fought back with renewed vigor. Caesar was forced to commit his final line of veterans, his reserve, into the battle. After hours of hard fighting, the Helvetii on the mountain were eventually broken and forced to flee. But the Boii and Tulingi weren't finished. They fell back to their camp and formed a desperate last stand, using their baggage wagons to create a makeshift fortress. From here, they hurled missiles down into the Roman ranks. The Boii were famed warriors throughout Gaul, and they fought like demons. The battle raged long into the night. Finally, after almost 12 hours of continuous fighting, the Roman third line managed to break into the camp. The battle was over. Caesar had lost perhaps 5,000 men, a significant number, but the Helvetii losses were catastrophic. Between 40,000 and 60,000 warriors lay dead on the battlefield. Of the 368,000 people who had begun the migration, only 130,000 were left alive. Caesar, with virtually no cavalry remaining, couldn't pursue immediately. He gave his men 3 days to recover from the carnage before starting the hunt. When the Helvetii saw the Romans coming after them again, they surrendered completely. They were forced to return to their homeland and became vassals of Rome, acting as a buffer between Roman territory and the Germanic lands beyond. Caesar had achieved his first objective, a swift military victory that would keep his political enemies in Rome at bay, at least for now. But this was just the beginning. Word had already reached Caesar of another threat, a Germanic tribe that had crossed the Rhine and was terracing Gaul. The Suebi, led by their king Ariovistus, had first arrived in Gaul back in 63 BC as mercenaries. The Sequani and Arverni had hired these 15,000 Germanic warriors to help in their war against the Aedui, who happened to be Roman allies. Ariovistus and his warriors proved decisive, helping secure a crucial victory at the Battle of This forced the Aedui to become tributaries to the Aedui naturally sent an envoy called Diviciacus to Rome, asking for help. But Rome was distracted. The Republic was still reeling from the political shock of the Catiline conspiracy and was dealing with an Alabragus revolt. The governor of Transalpine Gaul was ordered to help Rome's Gallic allies when possible. But in 59 BC, the Senate actually named Ariovistus, a friend of the people of Rome, to try and keep him quiet. Ariovistus used this time wisely. After helping the Sequani win their war, he demanded a third of their lands as payment. The Sequani, having little choice, agreed. Ariovistus then began moving more of his people across the Rhine to settle in these new territories. By 58 BC, as many as 120,000 Suevi had crossed the Rhine and made Gaul their home. But Ariovistus wasn't satisfied. He was demanding even more Sequani territory to settle an additional 24,000 Germans, and he'd been taking hostages to keep both the Sequani and Aedui. Something had to be done, and Caesar was just the man to do it. Following his victory over the Helvetii, Caesar had been resting in Bibracte when he was visited by a council of Gallic leaders and diplomats. Led by they congratulated Caesar on his victory and begged him to intervene in the situation. Their argument was compelling. If the Germans continued their conquests, soon the Suebi would be directly bordering Roman territory. Caesar, of course, was delighted to help. But there was a problem. Ariovistus was officially a friend of Rome, so Caesar couldn't immediately declare war. Instead, he had to play this diplomatically, at least initially. Caesar invited Ariovistus to a meeting, which was declined. He then sent a diplomat with reasonable terms, returned the Gallic hostages, stop all hostilities, and Rome would continue to consider him a friend. It was actually a generous offer. Ariovistus could keep all the lands he'd already taken from the Sequani without a fight. All he had to do was stop expanding and causing trouble. Instead of accepting, Ariovistus doubled down. He sent a message back to Caesar, saying that if Romans could conquer where and how they liked, so could he. At the same time, those 24,000 new Germans were allowed to pillage Gallic lands as they pleased, with even more Germans preparing to cross the Rhine. Caesar now had his legal justification. He had a decree from the Senate to protect Rome's Gallic allies. The Suebi were threatening Roman borders, and Ariovistus had forfeited his status as a friend of Rome by continuing to attack Rome es allies. Once again, Caesar could present himself as the savior of Gaul. He gathered his 6 legions, roughly 30,000 men, and set out on the warpath. Both Caesar and Ariovistus recognized the strategic importance of Vercingetorix, the largest town in Sequani territory. Well fortified and well supplied, it would be crucial to the coming war. Both forces began racing towards the town, but the Romans, marching day and night, got there first. Caesar rested briefly while resupplying his legions. But as they rested, troubling rumors began reaching his men about the strength and ferocity of the Germans. Some of Caesar's own officers began having doubts. It looked like Caesar might have a mutiny on his hands. But Caesar was a master of military psychology. He restored order by announcing that he would face Ariovistus with just his most trusted ex-legion, if none of the others would follow. This inspired fanatical loyalty in the ex-legion, whilst shaming the others into rallying to the cause. Ariovistus, impressed by the speed with which the Romans had moved to take Vercingetorix, sent messages asking for a meeting. Only some cavalry would be allowed as bodyguards at a place called Vosges, in what's now Alsace. Caesar agreed, but the meeting was a disaster. Both generals just restated their positions. Ariovistus even went so far as to say that if he killed Caesar, many people in Rome would be grateful, showing that he understood the political situation in Rome perfectly well. Negotiations broke down completely after this, and the cavalry on both sides had a minor skirmish before retreating to their respective camps. A few days later, Ariovistus asked for another meeting. Caesar, sensing a trap, sent his translators instead. Just as well, Ariovistus promptly captured the 2 men and even considered burning them alive. With his plan to capture Caesar having failed, Ariovistus decided to move to battle. His army was impressive, minus 6,000 cavalry, 16,000 light infantry, and the rest heavy infantry, for a total of around 30,000 to 40,000 men. Taking Caesar by surprise, Ariovistus marched this force quickly behind Caesar's position and set up camp, cutting off the Romans from their supply lines. It was a brilliant tactical move. For 5 days, Caesar drew out his army in battle formation, willing to give battle. But Ariovistus was content to wait and slowly strangle Caesar's supply lines. He only engaged in cavalry skirmishes. And here the Suevi showed their unique fighting style. For every horseman, there was an infantryman mixed into their cavalry formation. These foot soldiers were lightly armed to keep up with the horses, and together they provided a flexible and difficult force to handle. The Roman cavalry got the worst of these encounters. Caesar knew he had to break this stalemate or risk being starved out. He formed his legions into 3 lines and marched past the Suebi position. Then he ordered his 3rd line to begin construction of a 2nd camp, whilst the first 2 lines formed up to defend them. Ariovistus sent all his light infantry and cavalry to harass the working legionaries, but seemed reluctant to commit his entire force. The Romans held them off Isali. With the 2nd camp complete, Caesar left 2 legions and part of his auxiliaries to defend it, whilst his other 4 legions returned to the main camp. This allowed Caesar to reconnect with his supply line, negating Ariovistus' strategy. Realizing his mistake, Ariovistus sent part of his army to attack the 2nd camp. The fighting was tough, lasting from midday into the evening, but eventually the Romans repelled the attack and even took some prisoners under questioning. These Suebi revealed something interesting. Ariovistus had apparently been told by his priests not to commit his army to full battle until after the new moon. That Sye had Ian used his whole army to prevent the Romans from building their 2nd camp. Learning this, Caesar decided to go on the offensive. He left small garrisons in each camp and formed his 6 legions into a triple battle line with his cavalry in reserve. Time to march on the Suebi camp. The Germans came out to meet him, forming their wagons and baggage train in a semicircle behind them. Their women stood on the wagons, urging their men on. Quite a sight that must have been. Caesar noticed that the German left flank was slightly weaker and positioned himself opposite on the Roman right. Then he gave the order to charge. But as the Romans charged, so did the Suebi. Their assault was so fast and fierce that the Romans had to drop their pella before they could even throw them, drawing their swords for immediate hand-to-hand combat. The Germans formed a solid shield wall, and for a time, neither side could gain the upper hand. Without being able to throw their javelins first, which usually broke up enemy formations, the Romans struggled more than usual. They took desperate measures, trying to wrench away German shields with their bare hands and even throwing themselves bodily against the shield wall. After hard fighting, Caesar's right flank began to push back the German left. But on the other side of the battlefield, the Suebi right was outnumbering their Roman opponents and starting to gain the upper hand. The Roman cavalry, led by Publius Crassus, son of the triumvir, Marcus Licinius Crassus, had Er and G yet engaged in the battle. From his position, young Crassus could see the Roman left starting to crumble. Using his own initiative, Crassus led the 3rd line, which had been kept in reserve, to support the failing flank. He arrived just in time to prevent disaster. With their left flank broken and their right now under severe pressure, the Suebi army broke and ran. We don't know exactly how many died in this battle, but the Germans, trying to retreat through their own wagons and camp followers, were packed so tightly that the dead couldn't even fall over. With this intelligence, Caesar convinced his Gallic allies, the Aedui, led by Divi, to invade the lands of the Bellovaci, a powerful Belgi tribe, to open a 2nd front whilst he marched towards the main Belgic army. Caesar crossed the bridge over the Exona River and made camp in a strong position on a hill. The river protected his rear, and marshy ground at the front made a frontal assault difficult. Caesar had learned from fighting Ariovistus. He left 6 cohorts in a well-fortified position on the other side of the bridge, securing his supply line. With no chance of being starved out, Caesar waited for the Belgae to make their move. The Belgae had marched to the Remi town of Bibrax, just 8 miles from Caesar's camp, and besieged it. Caesar claims the total number of the Confederation was 300,000, but that's almost certainly exaggerated. A more realistic estimate would be around 80,000 men, still nearly double Caesar's force. Facing such numbers, the Remi sent messages to Caesar, saying they couldn't hold the town without his help. But Caesar was reluctant to give up his defensive position. He suspected the attack on Bibrax was a trap designed to draw him out. Instead of taking the bait, Caesar kept his legions in camp but sent a substantial force of auxiliaries, mainly Cretan archers and Balearic slingers, to sneak into Bibrax and reinforce the Remi. With Bibrax thus reinforced and Caesar not falling for the trap, Galba marched his army to meet the Romans, making camp just 2 miles away. Caesar was in no hurry to engage such a large force. Instead, he focused on cavalry skirmishes to test the Belgae's strength, whilst further reinforcing his position with trenches and defensive towers. Realizing that attacking such a strong position would be suicide, Galba sent roughly 15,000 to 20,000 men to ford the river and attack the 6 cohorts on the other side, hoping either to draw Caesar from the hill or cut off his supply line. Caesar saw this developing and gathered all his light infantry and cavalry, marching quickly to oppose the crossing, whilst leaving his legions in their defensive position. The Roman cavalry arrived just in time, falling upon the few Belgae who'd made it across and forcing them back into the river. Roman missile troops peppered the Belgae still in the water with stones, javelins, and arrows. The Belgae tried desperately to continue their crossing despite taking heavy casualties, but Galba had no choice but to pull his men back. To make matters worse for the Belgae, word reached Galba that the Aedui were rampaging through Bilovaci lands. With the Romans so heavily dug in to his front and another army threatening his flank, Galba decided to withdraw. The plan was for the tribes to disperse to their respective homelands, but reassemble if the Romans marched further into Belgae territory. As the Confederation's army dispersed, Caesar cautiously pursued with his cavalry and 3 legions under Labienus, harassing the retreating Belgae. Due to their lack of coordination, the Belgae suffered heavy casualties during this retreat. The battle had cost the Confederation approximately 10,000 men and forced the tribes to separate, making them easier for Caesar to conquer piecemeal. Many tribes simply surrendered when they saw the Roman legions approaching, including the Bellovaci and Galba's own But deeper in Belgae territory, the Nervi had time to organize and weren't about to give up without a fight. The Nervi were outraged by Caesar's incursion into Belgae territory. Alongside their neighbors, the Viromandui and Adutici, they gathered an army of approximately 50,000 men, led by the Nervi king, Caesar, hearing that this force was gathering against him, marched for the river Sabis on the edge of Nervi territory. Bodonatas had learned from Galba's mistakes. He knew he couldn't allow the Romans the chance to fortify their position, so he positioned his men in ambush on a hill on the other side of the river. He also had his troops construct hedge-like obstructions on the Roman side of the river to disrupt their formations and cavalry. Caesar marched his army in 2 groups. His 6 veteran legions marched in front and were first to reach the river, beginning to construct a camp on a hill with the river in front. The 2 newer legions marched behind with the baggage train. Caesar sent his cavalry and light infantry across the river, only 3 feet deep here, to scout the opposite bank. They met some nervy cavalry, and a brief skirmish broke out. The Belgae cavalry fell back, drawing in the Romans, until suddenly the entire nervy force broke cover and fell upon them. The Roman cavalry and light infantry broke and ran back across the river to the Roman camp, the nervy army in hot pursuit. The Battle of the Sabes River had begun. The Belgae moved from the woods and across the river so fast that the legions had almost no time to prepare, but their experience and discipline kicked in. Rallying to the nearest cohort and legionary standards, they managed to form a coherent battle line. However, the legionary engineers hadn't had time to clear the campsite as they usually would. The legions were divided by the hedge-like obstructions Bodaunatus had laid down, preventing them from forming one cohesive formation. The result was that the legions were essentially fighting 3 separate battles, the 10th and 9th on the left against the Atrebati, the 11th and 8th in the center against the and the 12th and 7th on the right against the largest group, the Nervi. The 2 remaining legions, the 13th and 14th, were still with the baggage train. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Caesar himself went from group to group, encouraging his men and leading by example. Eventually, the Roman left was able to push their enemies back far enough to hurl their javelins into Atrebati ranks before charging. They forced the Atrebati back across the river, even making it into the Belgae camp. The Roman center was also finding success, pushing the Viramandui down to the river banks. But the Roman right was having serious problems. As the center pushed forward, the Nervi poured into the gap, almost surrounding the 12th and 7th legions and falling upon the auxiliaries who had retreated to the Roman camp. The remaining auxiliaries, including most of the Roman cavalry who'd been marching in front of the baggage train, saw this disaster and fled, assuming the Roman right had been completely destroyed and the battle was lost. They weren't being unreasonable. The 12th Legion had lost their standard, their chief centurion, most of their other centurions, and the Romans were beginning to break under the pressure. Seeing this disaster unfolding, Caesar knew he had to act immediately or risk losing the entire campaign. Snatching up a shield, he pushed himself to the front line of the legion, personally rallying the men's morale. With the 7th Legion also under heavy pressure, Caesar ordered them to form a defensive square with the 12th and hold their ground at all costs. At this critical moment, the battle began to swing in Rome's favor. Labienus, commanding the 10th and 9th legions, saw what was happening from across the river. He sent the 10th to relieve the Roman right, whilst the 2 fresh legions had finally joined the battle and were attacking the Nervi in the Roman camp. The Roman auxiliary cavalry, seeing this change in fortune, returned to the battle. Now it was the Nervi who faced potential disaster. The Viromandui fled upon seeing the Roman reinforcements arriving, and the Nervi found themselves surrounded on all sides. They fought bravely. Caesar even commended their courage later, but their defeat was now inevitable. The Belgae casualties were devastating. Caesar claimed only 500 Nervi survived the battle, though Roman losses had also been high, perhaps as many as 5,000 dead. Without Caesar's personal leadership and the timely intervention of fresh legions, the battle would likely have been lost, Caesar killed, and the entire campaign ended in disaster. But the Romans had won again. The Nervi surrendered and became vassals of Rome. The Atrebati were conquered soon after. Rome was now in control of most of Gaul. By 56 BC, Caesar had subjugated the majority of Gaul through either conquest or political alliances. He was beginning to look for new opportunities to expand Rome's influence further. But not all Gallic tribes were happy with Roman rule. One such tribe was the Veneti, located in what's now Brittany. Despite signing a peace treaty with Caesar the year before, they'd gone back on their word and captured several Roman officers. As a largely seafaring nation, the Veneti were confident they could rely on their powerful navy to force Caesar to make concessions. They'd calculated wrong. Caesar wasted no time trying to negotiate. He saw their actions as a direct declaration of war and immediately marched against them. Initially, he found little success. Thanks to their large navy, the Veneti could effectively hop from town to town, moving entire populations and their belongings by sea, denying the Romans either pitched battles or proper sieges. Standard Roman tactics proved completely ineffective. To win, Caesar had to defeat their navy first. With no fleet available, he ordered ships to be built specifically to take on the Veneti navy. But there was a problem. Roman ships were designed for the calm Mediterranean, whilst Veneti ships were built for the rough Atlantic. They were much stronger, much taller, and the Romans found them impossible to ram or board using conventional tactics. It was only through the ingenuity of one of Caesar's legates, Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, that victory became possible. He suggested using billhooks, long hooked poles to cut down the Veneti sails and cripple their ships. Brilliant. With this innovation, Caesar was able to defeat the Veneti navy decisively. Now, he could move on to new conquests. But once again, his plans were interrupted. In 55 BC, yet another Germanic horde began threatening the Rhine frontier. The Usipetes and Tentheri, tribes that had previously fought the Suebi, were now fleeing across the Rhine in huge numbers. Caesar claimed their total, including civilians. Caesar was worried that other Gauls might join forces with these Germans in an attempt to oust the Romans. Some Gallic tribes in the Rhine Valley had indeed sent emissaries to the Germans, providing food and intelligence, encouraging them to move deeper into Gaul. Caesar gathered a council of Gallic chiefs and convinced them to provide cavalry for his campaign against the Germans. This served two purposes. Rome's cavalry had always been lacking, and Gallic horsemen were renowned throughout Europe. Secondly, since cavalry was composed largely of nobles and wealthy individuals, they'd act as hostagers, ensuring good behavior. He gathered 5 legions and headed for the Rhine. The Germans had sent a large portion of their cavalry ahead of their main force for raiding. But hearing Caesar was approaching, they sent emissaries to negotiate. They asked Caesar for talks, claiming they were only in Gaul because they'd been forced to flee from the Suebi. They promised to ally with Rome if Caesar could provide them with land in Gaul. But Caesar suspected the Germans were just playing for time and continued his advance. Envoys continued going back and forth as Caesar marched towards the German camp, sending his 5,000 cavalry forward as an advance force, but with strict orders not to provoke an attack. However, when the Germans saw the Roman cavalry separated from the main force, they fell upon them. The Romans initially tried to hold their ground, but were eventually overwhelmed and retreated to Caesar's camp. Caesar likely understates the casualties taken. He claims only 74 dead, but he does mention that 2 brothers from the influential Pisa family died in the fighting. This was something Caesar couldn't let go unpunished. Caesar gathered his forces to attack the Germans immediately. But before he could move, the Germans sent another party of diplomats, including high-ranking nobility, to negotiate with Caesar. Once again, they asked for peace and apologized for the attack. Since the Germans had already attacked without provocation, Caesar refused. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, Please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!